Welcome to the No Truth Without Beauty Discovery series. Let's hear what author Leena El-Ali has for us. Why do you want to debunk the idea that women are second-rate beings?
When you read the Quran, it is very clear that both Adam and Eve were created from the same soul. That's the first thing. And then it tells us that they were created as mates to one another. Now, there is inbuilt equivalence there. Equivalence in essence, same soul, and equivalence in practice as mates to one another. You know, the word mate means one of a pair, right? In Arabic, zawj, one of a pair. So one doesn't get a sense from reading the Quran that the female human being was created as an afterthought, that it was a secondary project of some kind in God's creation plan. And then the Quran tells us that all men and women came from Adam and Eve. So that means that all men and women, regardless of their race, their physical or mental differences, their personalities, geographic locations, and whatnot, all human beings come from the same soul as Adam and Eve. But perhaps more importantly than that, in a number of verses in the Quran, we're told that that soul contains the divine breath itself. And that's something that we don't hear much talk about. And it's supremely important because we are in a privileged position in this creation project. And it means that, all of us, regardless of gender or race or what have you, we all contain that divine breath. Now, why am I talking about the divine breath in particular? Well, it's because, you read this in the Quran and it's so beautiful and inspiring. And along comes somebody and they say, well, but there's a hadith that says that the Prophet himself, hadith of course, is a report of a saying or an action by the Prophet Muhammad. So they tell us there's a hadith that says that the Prophet had once said that a woman is crooked by nature, like a rib. What happens if you try to straighten a rib? It'll snap, it'll break in two. So best thing to do is to just accept her as she is. Don't try to straighten her. You're not going anywhere, and just make the best of it. So, one hears this or reads it somewhere. And, we have to ask ourselves the question, as people who are, as entities who are imbued with this divine breath, we have to ask ourselves this question, and as believers, would the Prophet have contradicted the Quran? Is that conceivable? And the answer, of course, has to be no.
Your approach distinguishes between the Islamic and the Quranic. How is that distinction useful when thinking about the nature and place of women?
In brief, what is Quranic is what is written in the Quran, and what is Islamic is the sum total of everything that has happened during the course of Muslim history over the last 14 centuries or so. So a lot has gone down. And this is a very important distinction because, of course, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet over the course of the 23 years of his mission, from when he was age 40 till his death. So during the course of that time, as the verses were being communicated to him according to us, according to Muslim belief, by the Archangel Gabriel, they were being written down on parchments. And so within 2 years after the Prophet's death, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, had these parchments collected into a single volume because the people who had memorized everything during the course of the Prophet's life and mission, some of them were dying off. And so he had it all collected into a single volume. And 19 years after, that was collected by the Caliph Osman, the third Caliph, and that became the volume that is the basis of the Quran that we have today. And incidentally, even non-Muslim scholars of Islam and the Quran agree that what we have today is what was available 19 years after the Prophet's death. But what we call Islamic resides in the cumulative folds of what has happened over the last 14 centuries. With all of the ebbs and flows, the trends, the customs, the geographic expansion, the different, preferences in different places, customs, situations that needed to be dealt with. So this is, quite different because, I think what has happened is that we've gotten lost, in a sense, in this unfolding of Muslim history, so that anything that has been labeled Islamic by whatever power that be at a given moment in time and place, we've tended to take it on face value as being Islamic. That's it. It's its own bona fide source of legitimacy. And that is something that I think we need to look into a little bit more because, as I said, a lot has gone down for different reasons over a vast area of the globe. And we really must examine everything labeled Islamic through the lens of the Quran. We have to shine the light of the Quran on anything before we accept the label Islamic.
People usually talk about how Eve is to blame for the fall from the Garden of Eden, how all women are a source of discord or fitna in Arabic as a result of her legacy. But apparently the Quran says something very different.
It's really very, very straightforward. The Quran tells us that both Adam and Eve were tempted by the whisperings of Satan, that they were both banished from the garden as a result. The responsibility is placed on both of them together, equally. It's interesting because in English we have the singular you and we have the plural you. Well, in Arabic, there's the singular you and there's the plural you, but there's also a you in the middle for when you're referring to two, when you're addressing two people. So it's very clear in the Quranic narrative of what happened in the Garden of Eden that both Adam and Eve were, God was disappointed with both of them and banished both of them together. So, this idea that has come to us that, Eve is solely to blame for the fall from the garden, and that was because she was obviously the weaker party, and so all men are better than all women because they are really descended from Adam, whereas women are descended from Eve. That is just not compatible with the Quranic narrative, whereby they are both equal in essence at creation, and they both committed the sin of disobeying God at the same time together, using their own free will, both of them.
So where did all the unfavorable ideas about women's nature and about Eve herself come from?
Unfortunately, the unflattering reports about Eve and about women in general, they seem to have come from a handful of hadith. And I have to emphasize a handful because there are tens of thousands of hadiths, reports about the sayings and actions of the Prophet. that were compiled, and really they're only, and some of them, many of them are about women, but there's only a handful of unflattering ones when it comes to women, but they've come to dominate the discourse for some reason, and that's something, quite surprising. For example, Eve, as we've mentioned, is regarded as the solely guilty one for the fall from the garden. Apparently, most of the inhabitants of hell will be women, according to another. Another one is that women shouldn't be leaders because any society that has a female leader will be destined to ruin. It's really unfortunate because lost in that is sometimes evidence right before our own eyes that we don't think about or we're not aware of. For example, I discovered not long ago that the city of Jeddah in Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia, is named after Eve because Jeddah means grandmother in Arabic, and she's our original grandmother. And that is not a recent name. So, if she had been seen in such a negative light, would she have been honored with such an act as to name a city in that part of in the land where the Prophet came from after her? We have to remember something about Hadith also, which is a huge body of work. Hadith was compiled. They started to compile it about 200 years after the Prophet died. So you remember earlier we said that the Quran was being written as it was being revealed over the course of the 23 years of revelation. The Hadith, on the other hand, the scholars started to compile this about 200 years after the Prophet's death. And by the time they finished, and the volumes that we have today, those huge volumes that many of us might have heard of, Bukhari, Muslim, and others, they were completed about 300 years after the Prophet's death. But the point is that, there was a very genuine element of time and distance from the Prophet. And they contain tens of thousands of hadith. And as I mentioned, there's only a handful of negative ones with regards to women, even though they've come to dominate the conversation. But also, another thing to be aware of is that, the scholars collected everything. They didn't say everything was authentic. They didn't say everything was true. They just collected everything. They did their best to label them according to how likely they are to have occurred, these sayings or actions by the Prophet. But what they labeled was how likely the chain of transmission was. They didn't actually try to assess the content, to say, oh, this makes sense, and this ties in with what the Quran says, or well, this is a weak hadith because it runs contrary to the message of the Quran on this issue. They didn't get into that. Perhaps they wanted to be pious, exceptionally pious in that sense, and not judge anything and just collect everything. So they said, well, what they did, they decided just to assess things by the likelihood of that chain of transmission having occurred. How likely is this person have been to have known that person, were they of credible character, etc., going all the way back. So, between the fact that this exercise took place so much later, and the fact that not everything was, actually nothing was assessed with regards to its content as such, should give us pause and should really encourage us to go back and look at things through the lens of the Quran, because they didn't do that exercise for us. They did a wonderful exercise of collecting things, but we must not assume that everything that we hear or everything that we are told exists in any of these hadith compilations. Just because it exists and was documented there, that doesn't mean that it's true or that it's authentic or that it's solid. And the only way we can sort through all of this is to look at things through the lens of the Quran again.
Thank you for watching. Hope this episode has enticed you to discover the book No Truth Without Beauty, God, the Quran, and Women's Rights for yourself. All links are available in the description box below this video.